Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet wrapped in all kinds of layers of turbulence. Um, some of them kind of crash into each other, which makes it even more turbulent, unpredictable, and to a certain extent hazardous. This is Andy Revkin, another Sustained What episode. I've been quiet lately, but there's lots going on. And today we're going to talk about disasters, the events that emerge when a hazard intersects with a community with vulnerability. And this is happening a lot on the planet these days because of climate impacts. Some of this is from climate change, some of it's from the existing variability in the climate system, where rare things can explode on timescales that leave us sort of going, "Wow, what just happened? That feels unprecedented." But if you talk to historians or paleoclimatologists, you learn it's not unprecedented at all. It's just rare, and a lot of things happen in those gaps between rare events, like modern society in places like Istanbul, where I reported on earthquakes. In 1950, Istanbul was a pretty sleepy place with less than 1 million people. Now it's a metropolitan area of about 15 to 20 million people, depending on who you talk to. So when the inevitable earthquake happens there next, there have been many. There's so many more people in harm's way, and so many of the structures are not built for earthquake resilience, as we saw in that small and tragic episode just less than a year ago. Today, my guest is Daniel Starosta. I see I screwed it up already. Daniel Starosta, who is based in Florida, in Miami. In Miami?
New York these days, but
Oh, New York. Right. Spent a lot of time in Florida and in other parts of the world. And he's an interesting interdisciplinary scholar and doer, looking at how culture both reacts to and anticipates or doesn't anticipate these kinds of events, to some extent in the artwork and in lore. And then we have this habit of forgetting and then going, "Oh my God." These two illustrations you'll hear more about in a minute. One is a go away hurricane cake from in Florida. That was Hurricane Dorian, and the other is a centuries old depiction of the giant catfish that Japanese lore and culture sees as the source of great earthquakes, saw as the source of great earthquakes. Um, this is an interest of mine, writing my .earth blog and my articles for the New York Times for a long time. I kept running into situations where big bad things would happen. I covered tsunamis, a couple tsunamis, many earthquakes, and of course the looming and the unfolding disaster, slow motion disaster called global warming. And some of the patterns began to emerge. Like here's earthquakes. I talked to Roger Billam, University of Colorado, and he had done a paper back way over a decade ago. Oh, 2011, yeah. And these are the great quakes. These are those big bell ringers that have had terrible consequences for communities when they've happened in populated places. And look at from the 1950s through the early 2000s, as I have there, mind the gap. So all of modern infrastructure. So think about what happened to this planet between the 1960s and the turn of the millennium. A huge amount of stuff, and a lot of it was kind of oblivious to these hazards, which are there. They are rare, and so that's the earthquake version. Then there's a mega drought gap too. Um, Talking to other researchers, Park Williams and others, about using tree rings, they found again from the 1600s through the aughts, mega droughts decided. Well, they didn't decide. Earth didn't have these patterns in the Western states, and now we are getting back into a cycle of these. So when people say to me, "Oh my God, it's global warming," I stop and say, "Well, wait, it's just a long time scale plus global warming. Don't get stuck in how you think about these things." And on .earth on my blog, like this is 2008, a German reader, um, went by the name Florifulgerator. He wrote this comment one day. Yeah, it seems Homo sapiens at large needs to first get hit by the wall before changing path. There will always be someone debating the science of walls and bricks. We can't falsify the theory about the wall yet ahead, so it's no science, blah, 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 bang. And I've used that blah, 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 bang expression a lot since then in stories and in the talks I give. I'm just going to give you one example, and then we're going to dive in. Here, just last year, Vermont had an epic flood, and here's the news coverage. Unprecedented flooding in 2023. It happens that back in 2002, I wrote an article for the New York Times about long-term patterns of epic flooding, similar to, actually worse than what unfolded last year. And there was a flood, there was this November 1927, the flood of record in Vermont, which killed the lieutenant governor, tens of thousands of cows, and dozens of people died in that flood. And that's considered still, even with Irene and what happened in other recent flooding, the worst. That's well before the thing we call human-driven global warming was in play. And the paper that I wrote about at the time said that there's evidence of many of these going back through several thousand years. So all of this to me leads to a kind of a pattern I hope everyone, not just journalists, can pursue, which is when someone says unprecedented, here was smoke and fire, I can go into a whole nother spiel on that. I always ask, since when? Because rarity, there's a difference between something that's rare and something that's truly unprecedented. And sometimes the same phenomenon can be something that happened in the past and is happening now for a different reason. And those are the reasons it's important to dig in on this, the culture of it, the language of it, the art of it. And that's why I thought Daniel would be a great guest today. So Daniel, great to have you on. And maybe you could start with a little bit of a spiel on what's brought you these dimensions, what's brought you to these dimensions of how communities and dangers intersect and what they do and don't do about it.
So the short of it really is that I studied archaeology and art history in undergrad. I was going to be an archaeologist for a very long time. That got derailed by civil war of all things. But I'd also grown up in Florida, and I knew hurricane culture very well, even though at the time it was just sort of disguised as the way we do things. And over time, I realized that the things that we had normalized were not normal to anybody else except for us. And eventually I got into emergency management and disaster resilience and climate adaptation. And by the time I realized a lot of the gap between localized DIY type measures and institutional critical infrastructure measures, there was a huge divide between the sort of understanding of why certain places did things certain ways. And so I try to put on my art history archaeology hat and realize that there's so much more if you consider culture as critical infrastructure and memory and identity as something that you can build policy around, not just sort of the fallout, I guess. When I looked at the art, music, and literature that communities were producing in the wake of disaster, it opened up a huge new place to sort of rebuild the theory behind disaster management, I think, and how we can build programs that actually meet people where they are rather than assume so much about what they're doing.
Yeah, boy, that idea of meeting people where they are and understanding their contexts and how they use language and how they perceive risk and what their history is, whether they're immigrants or all of that is so important to everything, including pandemic preparedness, which is another kind of disaster, right? This is not limited to geophysical hazards.
But one of the tough parts is, and you hinted at it in the introduction, is the history side of things. A lot of the reason I ended up pushing towards the examples that I'll talk about in a little bit was an article I found showed that disaster-related memory only lasts a maximum of 2 generations. You have but that is before, that was in tsunami areas in Japan. You have 2 generations before communities start building back under the tsunami stones, or the high water marks that that people commemorate historic loss around. And that, I mean, that makes sense in sort of the wider context of, as soon as when you have primary history from those who lived it, they teach their kids. And then those who heard stories from their grandparents or their parents then teach their kids. But then you have a bigger and bigger gap, and the details get lost in the mix. Exactly. And at that point, you're no longer sure who you're hearing it from and how valid it is. And then it's a very quick process to do the contrary.
By the way, is that pattern of 2 generations for forgetfulness, is that kind of consistent even with technological change, or is that something that's more historical? I guess there's no way to have a 50-year quotient coming back into modern time, because we haven't.
It might be changing now, but that's patterns seem to go back several thousand years. And the article was done it studied, I believe it was the late 40s.
Interesting.
And so things may be changing, but I think that humans, we think about human time, not geological time. And the change comes at a geological pace. And we're a blip in the grand scheme. And so it's sort of hard, I think, for us to think on a wider scale than even 2 generations.
Well, and thinking back right now to Holocaust denial and people's understanding of nuclear war, actually, is so vague now. When I was a kid, it was a little less vague because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the like. But so maybe that pattern does hold still, because these are things that are basically 2 or 3 generations past. And
I mean, there's a slide a little further down on a phrase that I didn't know until I found it: nuclear semiotics. It's the symbolism and design around nuclear warnings. And it turns out that the U.S. government invested a huge amount of money to try to figure out how can we show what the idea of a warning looks like for the next 10,000 years, because toxic waste will be toxic for the next 10,000 years. But what's to say that our symbolism of thumbs up won't mean thumbs down, or that a happy face won't mean total destruction?
Right.
They brought architects, designers, theological scholars. How do we build this sheer visual aesthetic of warning around this is a bad place, please don't come in?
Right. Yeah, that was for the repository for nuclear waste.
Exactly.
In the Southwest. So we could run through. I do think it's worth going through your sort of your narrative here. So this is the title of a paper, a project that you have done. I guess I have it set up for me to control it. You could just give me a next.
Sure. So I suppose, so raised under bad stars. I'll explain on the next slide. So the word disaster comes from the Italian Latin for bad stars, essentially, which is why I use that as the name for it, and it literally means to lose one's star. And this goes to the idea that are disasters natural? Are they social? Are they socio-political? And in the context of the development of the word, people decided that when a disaster happened, it meant that they'd been literally abandoned by their lucky stars, by their patron stars. And so they had no agency, nothing they could have done, nothing they could have prepared for. It was simply the way of the world. And I thought that was such an interesting approach to the idea of being able to do something to prepare, or do you simply let it go as is? And then it turns out that we chronicle those events wildly differently depending on where you are. Even in Southern Europe, that had not been a place of regular disaster compared to places like Southeast Asia, where earthquakes and tsunamis had been happening for thousands of years, to the point where it was not this crazy new thing. It was a very normalized thing. And so they saw through a very different theology. So I guess next slide.
Oops, hold on a second. Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
So here we are back to these tsunami markers, which I wrote about after that horrific tsunami. And but you note here that this pattern of warnings etched in stone or the like transcends the coastal towns of Japan.
Yeah, like their commemoration is nothing new. The way we do it changes, certainly, and the way we assume different places do it changes. I don't think if you ask most tourists that have gone to Rome recently, will they assume that it's been flooded 6 feet high dozens of times over the last 500 years? Probably not. Venice, certainly. But they had this 16th century flood marker. And then in Mississippi, we've changed the way that the Mississippi River works over the last 100 years, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't gone, I think that's probably maybe a 15-foot high marker. How we show it and whether we show it, these aren't necessarily very publicly accessible areas, but they still mark the places. So if you go to the next slide, this is just for context, but the red spot is where I grew up. And so like I said, I grew up on what was assumed to be a very normalized thing, even from childhood. But Hurricane Andrew was the first major hurricane in almost 70 years in South Florida. And it's well documented that nobody had any idea what to do. And sure, credit up to there was no internet, and there wasn't a ton of understanding around what would happen if a Category 5 hit. But even the emergency management system in South Florida is documented as not having any context for what to do should something like this ever happen. And then if you go to the next slide, this is what happens once you start having some culture of hurricanes. In the 20s, the Miami Hurricanes, the University of Miami named their team. These are cakes from Publix, the beloved supermarket throughout the Southeast. I have many Miami Hurricanes shirts. I've never eaten a hurricane cookie cake, I'll admit, but I did go to hurricane parties regularly growing up. And hurricane parties are, for those that may not know, essentially, if a hurricane is coming, you bunker up at the home of the person who is furthest away from the storm, in a different flood zone, or even if they're on the hospital grid, which means that they won't lose power. And by a certain point, for me, it was sort of teenagehood. You knew exactly whose house was definitely going to lose power and whose house wasn't. And it became fun. It became a fun thing, which is insane to some people. But then historically, if you look at how Florida has treated storms in the past, now they're named.
By the way, I'm showing.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm showing here a 2019 hurricane party.
There you go. So now we have names for hurricanes, but in the 20s and 30s, they were literally tracked as 1 quart, 2 quart, or 3 quart storms based on how much booze you were going to buy at the store to outlast it, which is, comical. But again, disasters and all kinds of concerns like that end up being deeply social affairs, whether we like it or not. And the fallout ends up being just as social. If you go to the next slide. So here, I took both these photos at the marina that I go fishing at when I'm back in Florida. And funny enough, so this is a regular phenomenon in Florida to graffiti your own shutters based on whatever may be coming. Irma, the Not Here Irma sign has since been updated. Irma was crossed out, and they added Matthew, and they crossed it out, and they added another one. And if you go to the next slide, there is, and this is something that I talk about at length, is there's clearly a visual language through which the people of South Florida are talking about this.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're necessarily preparing. It puts a low ceiling on what we're doing if a hurricane party is the best we can do. But at the same time, there's literally a mascot for the Miami Hurricanes. And there's a way of talking about, you don't scare us, Irma. Even the U in We're Ready for You, Dorian, that's the logo of the Miami Hurricanes. So there's clearly a general understanding of what a hurricane is and means and how we express ourselves in that context. And if you go to the next slide, some places have used the same shutters for decades, and they have outlasted all of them, and they've survived. And that is also a point of pride to show just how long you have been a veteran of how many different hurricanes. And so again, it just goes to further cement the idea that hurricanes, that all disasters end up having some social component. And there should be a way of better integrating that understanding into the broader disaster management canon.
Yeah.
And so I talk a lot about Florida sort of as the most potential with not the most fulfilled potential, I suppose. All the pieces are set where everybody gets it, everybody understands, and yet are we doing enough? I don't think so. And so if you go to the next one, I'll talk about Japan and the catfish, and talk about what a slightly more realized potential looks like. So for context here, as you mentioned, the Japanese sort of foundational myth says that under Honshu, under the big island of Japan, there's a giant black catfish that when he wriggles to try to get out from his prison, that's when an earthquake happens. And there's always the thunder god who is holding him down, and he's the one that's keeping him in check. But sometimes he forgets, or he falls asleep, or he lets go. And so these prints came out of a really interesting situation. It was 1856, I think it was, or the 1850s, when a massive earthquake hit Edo, and that was right in a unique socio-political moment for Japan when it was opening up to the world. A lot of different countries were trying to make their way in. I
think that was in Shogun recently.
Exactly.
For those who saw Shogun.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Shogun in a second too. But it's basically that. It was in a moment of social-political upheaval, and people, the Japanese people, were essentially realizing or deciding that there was no more divinity to the empire. They were just people. And after this massive earthquake, where tons and tons of people died, they decided enough. We want to talk about our anger, and we want to protest. And so dozens and dozens of these all anonymous block prints showed up all around the city that talk about the idea of this catfish as the earthquake to critique the government. And again, because it wasn't a very open society at that point, they couldn't sign their names on it. But you get a ton of different ways. Sometimes they're pro, sometimes they're anti, sometimes they're just trying to talk about it in a general sense. So the one on the left, obviously, the catfish is destroying everything. Everything is on fire. You can see the destruction pretty clearly. And the person on the bottom is the one who fell asleep while in his charge of holding the catfish down. On the right, you can see that the whole community is trying to kill the catfish, as a show of community unity. If you go to the next one. So this is where you start seeing the divides. On the right, you see a literal tug of war between the thunder god, who is supposed to hold him, and the now kind of weirdly humanized catfish. But you have different people rooting for different gods, essentially. You have the rich. Sometimes it's not even the rich; it's the people who would have benefited from the disaster. So home builders, construction workers, the political elite. Those are pro catfish. They are in support of what may happen after, and the people who lose out on those things are the ones on the left who are rooting for no earthquake, essentially. And the same thing happens in the left one, where you see the top is the political and social elite, and the bottom is the political and social downtrodden. And so it becomes, sometimes it's a class thing, where top to bottom, sometimes it's a different socioeconomic thing. And if you go to the next slide, so these are two of my favorite because they're the sort of oddest ones. On the left, there are people out partying with these catfish. There are dozens of catfish and lots of people, and they're out having a great time. And for these people, these Namazu characters, Namazu is the name of the catfish. They are integrating themselves into the pantheon of the catfish. They are benefiting from it. They are trying to ingratiate themselves into his good graces, hoping that nothing bad will happen the next one. And some people saw that side of it, where if we commit to being a friend of the disaster, perhaps it won't happen to us next time. And then on the right, this is a reference to the giant black American ship that was Commodore Perry's black ship. If you want to pull up a photo of it, Commodore Perry's black ship sat in the Japanese harbor for days, threatening to destroy all of Edo again in the wake of its sort of opening, and that is how the American forces forced the Japanese economy to open to American interests. So exactly. So there's a few that mimic sort of the exact artistic aesthetic of the other one, which is why it was sort of so stunning to me that they would replicate that exact literal vision of what the Japanese people may have seen. And if you go back to so there's a lot of money throwing in these. So there's a lot of the idea of what happens to the economy or what happens to the people, because and you can kind of see that there are literal coins being shot out of the blowhole of this giant catfish. And so it ends up being it's constantly a very nuanced, complex perspective on what is happening in each of these. What miniature universe does it explain about what the Japanese community was doing, what the empire was doing, what the imperial government was doing? Were they serving the interests of the people? Who was fighting? Again, all this was anonymous. And the reason that I love this is if you go to the next slide.
Hold on a second.
Yep.
You're reminding, by the way, me of Naomi Klein's book on disaster capitalism.
There's a lot of it. She's a great writer. So all the earthquake evacuation signs in Japan still have catfish on them. And so that for me was sort of the nail in the coffin in a good way of why this is so important. If you are a community that has a long history of a visual language, a visual aesthetic, that you know how to talk about, and you could be totally illiterate, but if you understand the context of what catfish means in Japanese culture, you understand that this is telling you a warning on something related to that. And for many people for which it's a deep-seated story from their parents or their grandparents, that's enough. And so if you watch Shogun, this isn't a spoiler, but my favorite character, Yabushiga, goes hunting for these ghost catfish, and he's blaming the catfish for everything that has happened in the collective experience of the town, and that is what he was talking about, because for him in that moment, the Namazu, the catfish, was still a huge hold on how they saw the world. It was a big symbol of, have they done something wrong? Have they not done something wrong? Did they deserve this? And so how we talk about and how we normalize it ends up meaning a lot, and shows whether or not we're able to build a culture, or in this case, build critical infrastructure that recognizes that, which very few places are able to do.
I want to. You mentioned this earlier, sort of social infrastructure as being discounted often, and this has come up before for sure in my reporting. I mean, I know Eric Kleinenberg's work on the Great Heat Wave in Chicago in the '90s, where communities, blocks that had more social cohesion had lower mortality rates from the disaster that was unfolding for the whole city.
Yeah.
So that's a demonstration that things we don't think about as infrastructure, like who knows where the old person is in the building with no air conditioning, or even now the role of social media or whatever could be, exploited, or the best parts of it, and building a picture of vulnerability in a community, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficult parts there is a lot of the places that are most organized at the community level aren't necessarily organized out of love for their neighbor. They are organized out of need, out of requirement, because they've been disenfranchised to some amount by the institutions of the governments that are supposed to support them. I'll say that having just done relief work in Maui after the wildfires in August, I shout out to any Hawaiians listening in. I was blown away by how organized they were, how the West Maui community was so put together for everybody that was affected, and the amount of infrastructure that went up within days was stunning.
Wow.
And so credit to them for having that, wherewithal to get going that quickly. And unfortunately, I think it was partly because they didn't assume anyone was going to come for them. And so that gap also speaks volumes for me to how much disaster management and climate adaptation needs to understand local communities at this level of nuance, so that it can actually inform how they build around those communities, for the future.
Fantastic. Well, let's go back to the overall story here then.
Yeah.
So this is all sort of, as you say, formulation. Let's go to tsunamis.
Yeah, so the Indian Ocean tsunami killed more than 200,000 people in 2004. One of the really, and the vast majority of those people were in Indonesia. In Aceh in particular, that's the top circle. Aceh had been in open civil war with the Indonesian government for 35 years at that point. And they did not have, let's call it, the luxury of building culture around anything except for civil war at that point. Right. They were also a very conservative, very separatist Muslim political movement. And so they had a pretty closed off approach to everything, really. Versus Similui, which is the island about 100 kilometers south, the second circle below, not very far at all. Similui had been hit by a big tsunami in 1906. And they took it upon themselves to turn tsunami education into culture. And so for the next century, they literally invented holidays around holidays disguised as, disaster preparedness disguised as holidays, to the point where they have lullabies that they teach their kids, to the one on the left. So smong is a tradition. Smong literally means the equivalent of tsunami in the Hawaiian language. But there are lullabies that they teach their kids that are very didactic and tell them exactly what to do when a tsunami might hit. Another stanza of this says that if the water goes out, run up the hill. And so to have that in your cultural context, that you don't think about it too much, but the minute you see the water go out, something triggers in your head that you should do that next. That's a very clear tool. It's culture as tool, essentially. Like I said, culture as critical infrastructure, which can make a huge difference. I think in the tsunami, I think it was a dozen people died in Similui compared to 80,000 people in Aceh. And so that shows that not only on one side, having civil war and not having the ability to create that amount of culture, but also the willingness and commitment to it. And if you go to the next slide, there's also a huge component at the youth level, and being able to talk about it, being able to process different levels of trauma. Is there a good way to do it? Is there a better way to do it? And so these are from the 2000, I can't remember, 2018, I think, bushfires in Australia, and the 1989 earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake in California, where teachers realize that if we use the tools that people have and that they know how to use, and we essentially, again, disguise PTSD processing as art activities, that's another way that we can begin to talk about how we feel, what we need, what our problems are, and so there's a big push to also include the arts as treatment in response to it. And so if you go to the next one, you mentioned the 1927 Vermont floods. I want to talk about the 1927 Louisiana floods. So this is in response to the song Louisiana 1927. No, you're good. By, I'm forgetting what his name is. 1927, what's his name? Randy Newman. Yeah, so Randy Newman sang the song because his mother was from New Orleans. He spent time in New Orleans but wasn't from there, and he sang it to commemorate. The song was written in the 50s or 60s, I believe, and so he was already a little bit removed, but he had a lot of love for New Orleans, and it had always been sort of an extra thought in modern New Orleans musical canon. It hadn't been the core of their existence. And then a lot of artists, including the Neville Brothers, which are staples of the New Orleans music scene, they needed an anthem in the wake of Katrina, but didn't necessarily have the energy to come up with a new one. And so they looked back to what already existed in their musical canon, which was Louisiana 1927 by Randy Newman. And so that song, again, in the mid-2000s, became a Katrina anthem for New Orleans musicians. And you can see in the line here from an interview with him of, I can't sing that song too often because it takes too much out of me. An old song suddenly becomes a new song because it has the exact same context, place, understanding, importance. And it requires a community having some level of longevity or having some culture to latch onto from the previous one. And if you go to the next one, sometimes that culture goes back 40,000 years. This is in Australia. So the painting on the left is a modern version of the Dreamtime Storytelling. I can't remember now. Which is the Aboriginal traditional painting style. And this is a fire line. This is a brush fire. And brush fires have been happening in Australia as long as there have been humans, for which we have proof of human habitation for 40,000 years. And so the idea that we now have a 40,000-year artistic tradition that can be updated regularly. This is from only a few years ago. And the photo on the right is from one of the rangers that in the last several years, Australia has given back a lot of the control of the huge, Australia is huge, so they don't necessarily have the capacity to monitor all the areas. And who best knows the areas where the Aboriginal communities to live? The communities that still live there. And so in giving them more power and control over those areas, not only are they allowing those communities to connect to the culture of a place, not only are they bringing more people to protect that place, they're also in a selfish way, they're taking, they don't have to do it anymore because they're giving the responsibility back to where it belongs, but that is no longer part of the government, like the FEMA equivalent responsibility. And so it becomes a multifaceted culture, infrastructure, ecology of we're giving it back to the people, and because they have thousands of years worth of history around which they know how to handle it, and also certainly in the last 200 years, not so much lately, but the Australian government trying to stamp out all of Aboriginal culture. And so this is also an opportunity to revive a lot of that.
Right.
We've seen that most notably probably in New Zealand, but there's clearly a major revival in the culture and how that translates to land management.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and if you go to the next slide, sometimes infrastructure is not exactly what you expect. Is the Waffle House indexed critical infrastructure? I would argue yes. For those that don't know, Waffle House, beloved Southeastern and Southern institution, does not close for anything, including usually hurricanes. To the point where FEMA started using whether or not Waffle House was open in a certain area as a clear indicator of how bad the hurricane was going to be. Waffle House literally has multiple different levels of menus depending on whether they still have power, whether they still have water, and it changes with each level of severity. And yeah, it's a running joke. I mean, you can see how ridiculous it is that Waffle House lost. Full lights on, limited menu, and there was a line that I always loved that says Waffle House is a hurricane shelter disguised as a restaurant, which again, and the interesting thing here became that FEMA recognized it, recognized sort of its value of it, its sort of hidden value, and operationalized it. They decided, okay, this is now going to be an actual measurement of us tracking culture at that level, and we can see how else we can integrate that in both directions. That we're now there's a clear communication between Waffle House and FEMA and Waffle House to see, is there a way where we can work together better? But they didn't need to. They could have just left it alone. And so that speaks to the willingness to actually talk about it and respect what those communities are doing.
Right.
Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Or it doesn't always work right. If you go to the next slide. So on the left, we have a no-build sign from Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Sometimes you try to do a lot of the response and recovery work, and your heart's in the right place, and it does the opposite. These no-build zones were meant to move mostly fishing communities away from Tacloban, where they were, towards a little bit inland. But it meant two huge problems. First, you now were putting fishermen 10 kilometers away from the coast, which meant that they no longer had access to their only viable economic livelihood. And second, you were literally dumping them in someone's backyard without telling them. And so you now had a displaced community in someone else's community, angering that community for the government not telling them that we're actually going to put several thousand people in all the open lots that you use to farm taro. And so that became a huge issue, not just to the point of causing conflict locally, but some of the fishermen began rebuilding very low key houses in the no-build area, but they purposely built them shoddy enough so that nobody would think that they were actual houses. So they would spend time in those shacks so that they could fish in those areas. So not only are you flying under the radar, but you're also building temporary shelters that, should something happen, you're now in the worst possible version of that shelter. So you're not being protected across all those levels. And then on the right, this is an image from 1862 when Sacramento was under 25 feet of water. You may have come across this as well, but there's Perilous Bounty is one of the books about it that I came across, at least, that talks a lot about how in 1862 the entire Central Valley of California was under 20 plus feet of water. The governor had to leave Sacramento for several months. Tons of people perished. And is this taught in schools in California? Not a peep. And And that was not super long ago.
No.
But it speaks, and I remember reading that one of the cities that was most lucky in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, of all things, was Sacramento, because Sacramento had been rated even worse than New Orleans in terms of flood possibilities, and had done very little until that point to improve it. And now Sacramento and Roseville nearby are rated significantly higher because they've actually done a lot of the infrastructure. But at the same time, California has not instituted the education to teach youth or people doing land management or disaster management or water management around these floods, that you can't prepare for something if you don't know it's possible. And you mentioned it in the chart at the beginning of, if you grow up in a lull,
Right.
the assumption is that thing doesn't exist. We saw this even in Haiti. In 2010, Haiti was founded just after a massive earthquake. And there was no earthquake for 275 years. And so all of Haitian infrastructure was built to withstand hurricanes, rightfully so. Where you want really strong buildings, you don't want them to flex. And unfortunately, those same buildings are the worst thing you can do for an earthquake. And so all of the buildings collapsed because they had been built otherwise. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a little bit about the nuclear semiotics.
Right.
So on the left, you see the sort of potential vision for what a scary place could look like. And on the right, you see some of the potential symbols that the U.S. government team started coming up with. If you want to go to the next, we can talk about this, but if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So here's sort of a timeline of some of those, some of the disasters that I've been talking about. And you can, going back to the original point about the two generations, let's say it's 50, 60, 70 years. You can see that it's just about that time between, if not more, between major hurricanes that we know to have been really destructive. And some places didn't even have the luxury of that kind of memory around which to build those things. And some places we don't even know that they rebuilt. If you look at the bottom, Lisbon was destroyed completely in 1755, every
Right.
single building. And they rebuilt it with a really major forward-thinking vision at that point. And so all of contemporary Lisbon is new. It looks old because it's a couple centuries, but it's a young city in Europe, all things considered.
Right.
And so how we commemorate those things really changes a community's willingness to engage. And unfortunately, the way we commemorate can also commodify that, and it makes it harder to take it seriously. So if you go to the next slide, I might be the only scholar on record doing critical analysis of Sharknado, but there is a lot to be said, I think, on how we showcase what a disaster looks like, what a person does in the context of that. There were actual reports of people at the in some drill in Los Angeles trying to do like what The Rock would do. They were trying to rappel down their apartment building with a sheet, and it's understandable because the way that we're showing what some people might do is comical to the nth degree, and not anybody is going to be able to rappel down a whole building with a shoelace. But that's how we talk about it. We talk about it in a way that looks like Sharknado and doesn't feel serious. And the biggest problem, or the biggest risk, I think, for me is if you talk about it in a silly way, nobody's going to be able to actually think it's real when it happens. And that happened a lot, I would say, for Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. A lot of the communities that I talked to when I was doing some of this research said they took Hurricane Hugo seriously in 1989. That was for them, that was the first major hurricane in their lifetime. The previous hurricane there had been in the 20s or 30s. There was a minor one in the 60s. But But that was the one where everybody said, this is the bad one, everybody must prepare, and they did. But it wasn't bad for everybody. And so when suddenly every hurricane for the next 20 years became the big one, people stopped preparing. And there was a lot of disheartening or discouragement in those communities because they felt like they had not been adequately prepared or warned for what Irma and Maria could have been. And I think that a lot of the infrastructure that was developed in the previous decade suffered from the same result. If everything is an emergency, nothing is an emergency.
Right.
And then you also get to a point of sort of in that of you lose the context from what that warning was. If you go to the next slide. So When the Levee Breaks was written also for the 1927 flood.
Right. Great song.
I can't remember what the artist's name is, but that also speaks volumes because a lot of people can't remember who originally wrote it because the version that most people gravitate towards is the Led Zeppelin version or the Bob Dylan version, I guess. But it has been, in my opinion, fully decontextualized because now you have a bunch of white birch guys singing the song that doesn't mean anything in London, doesn't mean anything in Europe, and it is at its core a black blues song from the Bayou, which means a lot in the Bayou but doesn't mean a lot elsewhere. And so if the song loses context, is it still considered some kind of warning or commemoration? Maybe, but this is a tough one because unlike Louisiana 1927, the Randy Newman song, you can't pull as well from this one to recreate that sort of localized culture of resilience.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily feel like it's a song of New Orleans anymore, or of Louisiana, and that also depends on whether or not your community or your government is willing to act on that culture, not just whether it's been decontextualized. And so if you go to the next slide. So these are two silk drawings from China from the 13th century. There have been people studying the Yellow River flooding for time immemorial. For context, the catfish myth came out of China 5,000 years ago. So people have been thinking about this for a very long time. Does that mean that the Yellow River flooding is being institutionalized as this socio-cultural, technological infrastructure? In this case, no. The Yellow River continues to flood, and China has gone more the route of the Three Gorges Dam, which is a superstructure of a dam, trillions and trillions of dollars, but it doesn't necessarily meet anybody at their household level, community level needs. I understand in the perspective that China may be thinking a lot more broader at the city, at the regional level, and I get that, but that means that local communities are left to the wayside, and they are not being taken into account in the way that I'm advocating for. And sometimes there is a weird whitewashing of that situation too. If you go to the next slide. So these are two statues in memorials for the 1985 earthquake in Mexico City, where entire buildings pancaked into each other. I don't remember how many thousand people died, but it was one of the worst earthquake-related disasters, on record. And great, Mexico did a lovely job in commemorating. On the left is it was a seamstress factory, was totally pancaked. Everybody was killed, and so this is in response to that. And then the one on the right is generally a more broad commemoration. They attempted, or they started to try to do another, I believe it was the 30-year recognition or 40-year recognition of the of the earthquake, except they forgot to acknowledge that people from the 1985 earthquake were still homeless because the government had not tended to those people. And so in trying to do these memorials of the 85 earthquake and then also of the 2017 earthquake, a lot of the Mexico City community said, guys, like, what are we doing here? You can't commemorate people that you still haven't tended to and then try to move on to the next earthquake while still not having any of the infrastructure around the people that you claim to be championing. And so that became another, and the government decided to pull the plug on those commemorations, by the way. And so in that, I don't know if I would say that the community won, but the community impetus did change. And I will leave you on the next slide. That is a, is there?
I think that's it.
Oh, okay. There's a project that I love in Florida called Oh Miami. It's the poetry festival. And they did a project where they painted children's poetry onto the roofs of buildings that people flying into Miami International Airport can see. And one of them says in huge, huge letters, "I am from a place where it does not snow." And that is a third grader that wrote that line for part of her poem. And that to me, going back to the fostering local, socio-ecological understanding, it makes a huge difference on how people perceive their own place. Yeah. So this is
the Miami.
Yeah. So they do every year. They do all kinds of projects around how do you express what living in Miami is like. And a lot of that ends up being very heavy ecological hurricane rain related conversations, which I think is incredibly important to fostering that kind of understanding, even at the youth level.
That's great. Well, I have questions.
Of course.
And this is, I see one right here from Lenny Chase, who says, have you seen any instances similar to the Japanese catfish phenomenon in North America, where an icon has been absorbed into common culture? Is that what the Hollywood films may be analogous to?
Not really. I think the only thing that I would argue is the hurricane flag, maybe. Like the Carolina Hurricanes, for instance, the hockey team have the hurricane flag as one of their alternate logos. But I don't think that there's a national symbol that we have that shows our understanding. I mean, also the U.S. is simply too big. It's too varied. There isn't a single icon that we can latch onto.
Yeah, in fact, I wrote a piece for the Times, a short article for the Weekend Review section a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago, when I think it was in January, and there was people jogging in New York. It was warm. There was a snowstorm in Colorado. And I wrote this piece, are we just too diverse in our meteorology and our risk landscape generally to have common symbols? And by the way, we don't have a national building code, and maybe that's actually appropriate because there isn't a single, except for gravity.
But I think to that point, if you break it into regional sections, then maybe there could be one for the South, one for the Southeast, one for the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. That's a different conversation, but I don't foresee a single national icon that we can latch onto.
Actually, one that I'm thinking about is something I haven't written about is flash flooding. Flash floods can happen anywhere where rain falls too fast to be, moved safely. And Andrew Kashevitz from Columbia University, who's a flood scientist there, was saying that literally is something that sort of don't turn around, don't drown.
Yeah,
that is almost ubiquitous.
I guess stop, drop, and roll. I suppose that's a thing we got. So yeah, maybe there's a way to get it together that way.
One thing I was going to bring up is that this year, for the first time in a long time, the hurricane cone graphic is changing. Here, let me see if I can put it on screen.
We can argue about spaghetti models and the cone of uncertainty all day.
I know.
And and that's another thing that I think is important is how are we democratizing access to terms like the cone of uncertainty or the spaghetti models? Does that feel normal or too highbrow? Does it feel too weird and lowbrow? As somebody who works across research and disaster response, I have like a foot on both sides of it, but I know that people on the ground, if I talk to people affected by a hurricane about the spaghetti model, they might tell me, what are you talking about? So it's weird in between.
For sure. And you mentioned stop, drop, and roll. I did a story, a piece, a blog, whatever you call what I do, a while back, trying to expand from the earthquake preparedness model to general community, like a day when communities shake out their vulnerabilities, identify and shake them out. And it was really interesting talking to some of the scientists and others working on this, because let me see if I can scroll down here. San Francisco, a number of years ago, there was a fellow who began something that seems like it could fit into your model of the community cultural, taking advantage of those existing historical norms, the hurricane party and their neighbor fests. He did a talk at FEMA on this, and where communities get together, someone organizes it, and you to me, it feels very valuable because you're bringing together the possibility of having the conversation about, we could be a lot safer in a heat wave if we know where the old people are who can't afford to run their air conditioner. Or just think about all the different sectors.
I fully agree, but I think one of the problems maybe in our current system is that a lot of the NERT, neighborhood emergency response training people are retired, they are old, and we don't have a big youth component to it. And so you have this weird dichotomy of the people who know how to theoretically save those in need are the ones who may end up needing saving. And so the people who do the saving don't have the training.
Right. So where, when you think, taking all the knowledge, you've worked in some communities, right? So talk briefly, and we're at 5 o'clock, but if you can go a little longer, that'd be fine.
Sure.
There are quite a few people watching. What when you go into a community, what are the sort of dynamics and factors? Where are the solution pathways here, given what you've laid out here, the knowledge, the importance of history, the importance of story, the fact that it seems to all fade. What leaps out to you as a way to start that process?
From a practitioner point of view, I think the most important piece really is first doing your research, understanding a community at its complexity and local nuance, and not just going in saying, we have the fix, we can fix you. That is the easiest way to alienate a community and to be kicked out the next day. And so when you have essentially a warm introduction, that happens because you do your due diligence. And I spent a week cramming everything I could figure out about the last 200 years of Hawaii and like Hawaiian legal water and law practices, and critical infrastructure around the last 5 years in fire management, and what a lot of the existing problems in Lahaina were going to be, and in the surrounding areas. And so when you go in not necessarily knowing what you're talking about, but understanding the problems that they are laying out and saying, I genuinely understand where you're coming from, that's very different from saying, I have solutions, I am looking for a problem to apply them to. And so that's generally, that is how I try to approach the work that I've done. And I've done open responses or humanitarian operations in most recently in Hawaii after the fires, in Puerto Rico after Maria. I've done recovery work in Florida, California. I've done preparedness work in Bhutan and Nicaragua, and research around the Philippines, Indonesia, Haiti, Australia, and Miami.
Yeah, and well, which is great because those are all places that really need that kind of insight. I didn't go to Nepal after the 2015 earthquake, but I did a lot of reporting, drawing on the wisdom of some engineers who spent time there. And when I did this piece, let's see, I think I'm sure. Oh, wait, I got to share it here. Hold on a second. One of my longtime contacts who had been there, he spotted a really promising sign of change on a critical factor that makes a building either fall down or not fall down in an earthquake. And it's this little thing, the rebar, the iron bar that goes inside the columns for a new. This was a building that was being constructed that he visited the site after the earthquake, and he saw that there's this bend right. You can see it here. There's a. I'm not sure. Whoop, hold on. I have this done a little awkwardly, but I do want to show it. Right here, there's a piece that bends around, completely loops around the vertical structure. And too often, what you get is the bend is only like a 90-degree bend. And it's like a bunch of spaghetti held together by some string. And it has a lot of structural stability, but only if that is completely bent around there. And he saw this in this particular building site. Again, this was a building that hadn't been built yet. He just saw this.
Right.
He said, look, they're doing it right. And they're doing it right, even though, and Nepal has an earthquake code, but they don't have the capacity to inspect and, do what you need to do to make a code meaningful. So he felt it was a cultural thing, that within the workforce, there's been enough pressure and crosstalk that they're doing the right thing now. And that feels like it's very resonant with what you're
and like one of the really difficult things is I am in no way rooting for disasters, obviously, but having a mini disaster that doesn't cause any real damage, reminding you of what a big disaster could do, holds a lot of weight, and it reminds people, and it causes stuff like this where like people may see, we had a little earthquake, maybe we should build around real earthquake codes because we might get a big one. And I think that places that have had that have fared much better. And if you look at even Turkey, which you mentioned at the beginning, I think there was a photo that went a little viral of I think it was like the building code or the constructions guild had this big, beautiful building surrounded by total debris because they had built their representative building up to code, but all the other buildings around it had been built not up to code. And so, of course, they fell after the major quake. And that happens time and time again where in a lot of places in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, if you build a house out of cinder blocks, if you build a house out of palm or bamboo or thatch, it might be perceived to be out of poverty or out of class. And so, no, we want cinder blocks because cinder blocks are what feels luxurious to us, which makes sense from a social point of view, and doesn't make sense from a building point of view. But then you end up with the complications of, is there a way to put rebar into cinder blocks to make it give it the facade of cinder blocks, but actually be structurally strong? How do you work within? Humans are complicated, and they are illogical on their best days. And so how do you work within that context in terms of applying much needed updates to programs and building codes that aren't necessarily ready for that buy-in?
Right. And how much of this is a function of just governance, poverty? I wrote a lot about the Turkey, about Istanbul's earthquake threat. I was there 2009, and ultimately I interviewed a billionaire his family had built a big chunk of what we consider modern late 20th century Istanbul using pretty lousy cement. And now he's saying, we'll rebuild it for you. We'll if you pay us to
Yeah, I
build
mean,
better structures.
I remember there were reports in Haiti of even in the rebuilding, in the initial rebuilding, where either out of malicious negligence or out of just not really knowing how cement worked, but for every bag of concrete, they were using too much water and not enough concrete. And so they were spreading it out to be able to build more bricks, but then they had more bricks that didn't work for anything. And so they were building bad houses again. And so how do you change that? How do you balance the idea of a local DIY resilience, which I find incredibly important? And there's a lot of people that are studying the idea of contextual engineering, of a very localized DIY, but as a respectable side of real construction and real engineering. But how do you balance that with building codes? Because your local DIY version actually has to withstand everything. And we've demonized indigenous practices and agroecology for so long that even though now that's coming back into the conversation over the last, let's say, couple of years, it has a lot of catching up to do. And so we need to make sure that nature-based solutions and all those things do the level of work that we need them to do and not rely on them a little too much.
Well, boy, Daniel, I really appreciate your coming on for this hour plus, and I kind of think we could even do another session or two going forward on, what templates for actualizing these insights might look like in different contexts. You are saying to me pretty much though that we're not stuck with blah 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 bang. If at the community level there's a sustained work to understand the dimensions of vulnerability and the pathways from that toward resilience or preparedness, it feels like there's lots to be done. I hope people can dig in on your work. You can find Daniel Starosta on LinkedIn. The main here, I'll show that your LinkedIn page. Daniel Starosta, disaster resilience and climate adaptation coordinator. That doesn't really adequately describe your skill set, but it's a good start. So thanks for being here today. And as soon as we're done, this can be shared on all these platforms. And I do think there's room to do more. So take care. And
thanks for having me.
Come back. All right, hold on 1 second.